You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Leading a business today means constantly adapting. On the Executive Insights podcast brought to you by AWS, global leaders share how they're making tough calls, testing bold ideas, and putting innovation into practice, generative AI included. If you're looking for real stories behind what's working, this is it. Subscribe to the Executive Insights podcast today. Available now on all major podcast platforms.
It has happened. Trump's masked stormtroopers ramped up their unwarranted immigration raids in my home state of California, setting off mass peaceful protests that the president dispatched military troops over the protests of our governor to intimidate and quell. Everything I've warned about with Trump is coming to pass, and right here in my own backyard. And at the same time, it seems that curriculum controversies, another front in the right's war on truth and social justice, have also now reached my local area, here in the progressive bastion of the left coast. I was recently present at a local school board meeting at which dozens of individuals ganged up to protest the implementation of a 5th grade puberty and hygiene curriculum that introduces some sex education in the form of anatomy and concepts related to identities. The protesters are claiming it sexualizes youth and puts them at risk of grooming, when the curriculum very clearly focuses on teaching about consent and educating them about inappropriate touch. Those objecting to the curriculum, which is widely used in other school districts across the state and aligns with all state and national health education standards, are relying on misinformation in their arguments. They made insinuations about a shadowy agenda, suggesting there had been a conspiracy to foist this curriculum on the public secretly, when in fact it had been entirely transparent, and claiming the curriculum was not approved by experts, when in fact it was reviewed by a medical advisory board full of pediatricians, doctors, and clinical psychologists with expertise in children's mental health. The real impetus behind the protest became clear when these protesters started quoting the Bible. It appears one board member has gone around to local churches, riling them up against the curriculum. And their principal grievance is the one section of the curriculum that addresses identities. This lesson, which uses the well-known diagram adorably called the genderbread person, simply provides a kid-friendly and accurate way to understand and describe all people as being a combination of biological sex and gender identity, who present their gender outwardly through various forms of expression, and may find themselves drawn, i.e. attracted, to various different sorts of people. If these straight cisgender protesters were honest, they would admit that they can find themselves in this diagram as well. Their sex, identity, expression, and attraction just happen to align with their cisnormative and heteronormative views. So their objection then is that their children might be exposed to the realities of LGBTQ existence, or that schools are not teaching students to view LGBTQ persons as aberrations or abominations. Of course, 3 decades of research have shown the importance of making all students feel acknowledged, valued, and welcomed, and has proved that comprehensive sex education that teaches the facts about gender variance and sexual orientation reduces homophobia and helps curb bullying. But of course, these religious objectors, who already have a right to opt their students out of this instruction, by the way, are bullies. They don't want this material taught at all because they want LGBTQ students to feel outcast and alienated. They want to indoctrinate their children against these identities and orientations because they are so fearful that their own children might be genderqueer or gay. And so they cry indoctrination when health curriculum simply seeks to inform students about the real world and the real people in it. And they appeal, as always, to their religious belief, or rather, the religious worldview that they and their churches have constructed for themselves based on biblical texts that don't actually condemn the people they have decided to hate. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. I wanted to get this episode about the push for religious exemption to the observance of LGBTQ rights released during Pride in June, but because of recent events with regard to immigration, I continued to focus instead on that topic. Though Patreon supporters will get this at the tail end of June, free listeners won't find it in their feeds until the 1st of July. But that's a great day to remind us all that Pride is a year-round commitment to LGBTQ plus affirmation and inclusion. Thank you for listening to License to Discriminate, LGBTQ rights, religious exemption, and the misreading of the Bible. Before we get on with the episode, I need to thank my newest patrons. Thank you, Jean-Michel Cote and Ran M. Baffle. And special thanks to generous new partner patrons, Wizard in a Tower and Martin Robusto. Additional thanks to Marcia Bowen and Brock Russell for recently increasing their pledge amounts. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons on Patreon. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode on the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act and the suspensions of habeas corpus in U.S. history, I released a minisode about other constitutional crises involving the nullification theory, focusing on the Little Rock crisis. And after my episode on America's long history of racist immigration panics, I released one about the Bracero program and yet another historical mass deportation campaign targeting Mexican laborers. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. I've spoken about curriculum controversies before on the podcast, most prominently in 2021, just before my episode on the furor over the 1619 Project. I released an episode called Curriculum Controversies in America, seeking insight into the then current outcry over critical race theory, by looking at numerous similar controversies throughout U.S. history. While some of the controversies in that episode, especially the Kanawha County textbook war, were implicitly driven by religious conservatism, I did not focus on religion, or more specifically Christianity, as the principal driver of these controversies. Perhaps the most famous curriculum controversy in the world, which I discussed in a Patreon exclusive directly after that 2021 episode, was the Scopes monkey trial, which was certainly a controversy pitting religionists against reason and sound education. And since then, as we've seen with all failed attempts to get creationism and intelligent design taught in science classrooms, the controversies sparked by fundamentalists and biblical literalists are numerous. Until more recently, religious objection to any curriculum that acknowledges LGBTQ people was focused on sexual activity rather than gender identity. during the AIDS epidemic, rather than allowing a frank discussion of sexuality and safety in schools, religious conservatives pushed instead for abstinence-only education, which was called quote-unquote ignorance-only education by AIDS awareness advocates, and blamed for contributing to the death toll. As of now, 10 states still have abstinence-only education in place, some of which allow discussion of sexual orientation only insofar as it emphasizes it as activity to be avoided, or in the case of one Texas health and safety code, that it condemns it as, quote, not a lifestyle acceptable to the general public, end quote. Perhaps the most notorious of these laws is Florida's Don't Say Gay law, which, like other laws, some of which it inspired, prohibits all classroom discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity. I won't try to pretend that these laws are only enacted on religious grounds, as obviously much anti-LGBTQ hate and panic is driven by simple homophobia and bigotry. But it is the religious arguments of the right that have proven the most successful at being taken seriously by lawmakers and courts. So it is those that I wish to deconstruct. Here in my home district, where the recent curriculum controversy erupted, data showed that very few families chose to opt out of having their child receive middle school sex education, except one particular school where the number of students opting out came close to 30. These students, it turned out, came predominantly from a group of Muslim refugee families, and I found it telling that these families were content simply to opt out of the curriculum and felt no need to protest the actual implementation of the curriculum itself. Of course, I realized that they very well might have protested the curriculum if the current anti-immigration climate did not make their presence in the country feel so uncertain. Indeed, one of the most recent Supreme Court cases to raise the question of religious exemption in relation to curriculum relating to gender and sexuality involves the complaints of Muslim families, along with Roman Catholic and Ukrainian Orthodox families. This case, Mahmoud v. Taylor, is a showdown between Maryland public schools and the religious over their right to opt out of K-5 English instruction when certain children's books with gay and trans representation are read. The legal notion at issue is, first of all, whether the content of the books is coercive, in other words, encouraging a viewpoint that contradicts their religious belief, and whether or not the simple exposure to such material, even if it is not coercive, can be considered a burden on the free exercise of their faiths. First of all, the books in question simply had gay and trans characters, and their only message with regard to gender and sexuality was one of acceptance and understanding, which causes me to ask whether these families would prefer books that teach persecution. Second, their entire argument is predicated on the notion that their faiths teach them or require them to deny the legitimacy or acceptability of gender variance and gay relationships. And as I will argue shortly, that is simply untrue, as neither the Bible nor the Quran explicitly condemn them, and some tortuous interpretations are required to find passages that might be portrayed as condemning them. But really, at the heart of this controversy and Supreme Court case is the complaint that Maryland schools denied these families the ability to opt out when it came to the books they are rejecting. The Montgomery County schools in question cite the administrative burden and absenteeism problems that resulted in continually having to remove certain students. But that argument is not as convincing to me as was their other point, that allowing students to opt out of any lesson or reading that exposed them to same-sex relationships or genderqueer characters stigmatizes any gay or trans students, as well as any students with gay or trans family members, who are suddenly made to feel that they or their family members are so problematic that entire groups of students cannot even be exposed to them. It is enough to make students feel like pariahs and to encourage them to hide their true selves, or even resent the loved ones who make them feel ostracized in school. In my local curriculum controversy, one similar sticking point is that though the protesting religious families have the right to opt out of the puberty curriculum entirely, they are not allowed, according to the California Healthy Youth Act that governs the institution of this curriculum, to opt out only of the section on identities. Of course, this encourages the conspiracism of the religious right, who suspect some agenda forcing quote-unquote gender ideology on them. But the simple fact is that this provision is only intended to prevent discrimination and the aforementioned ostracism. This is enough to sway me that opting out should not even be an option. Religious families are free to homeschool. Choosing to put their kids in public schools means that their children will be exposed to diverse cultures, divergent viewpoints, and all kinds of people with all kinds of relationships. To demand that public schools help them shelter their kids according to their strict religious worldview is nothing less than religious instruction, which has no place in public schools according to the First Amendment. What's behind these complaints, besides a desire to remove the separation of church and state and let religious instruction into public schools, is also a long-developing effort on the part of the religious right to enable discrimination. As I said, their efforts to remove gender and sexuality instruction from schools, and failing that to allow them to opt out only of that instruction, is by its very nature discrimination. And they have been seeking a license to discriminate however they want based on their faith for a very long time. We can trace the organized efforts to discriminate against and persecute the LGBTQ community in the U.S. all the way back to colonial America, when sodomy laws declared homosexual activity to be a crime against nature, punishable by death. These laws were not always strictly enforced, however, and same-sex eroticism was largely tolerated throughout the 17th and 18th centuries because it posed no threat to the status quo. During the 19th century, every state repealed their death penalties for sodomy law violations, though gay relationships continued to be considered taboo throughout the first half of the 20th century. In the 1950s, during the Red Scare, a simultaneous gay panic called the Lavender Scare took place, leading to an increase in homophobia, persecution, and even further institutionalized discrimination. The notion that gay people were more easily blackmailed than others was what first made them the targets of McCarthyism's anti-communist crusade, leading to the mass dismissal of federal employees suspected of being gay, and the official exclusion of any gay people from being employed by the federal government. In 1956, the Supreme Court decision in Cole v. Young prevented further discrimination when it came to firing federal workers, but Eisenhower's executive order barring gays from federal employment remained in place until the 90s, officially excluding gays from military service. It was in the aftermath of the Lavender Scare that the religious right took up a crusade against LGBTQ rights, led by a Christian country music star named Anita Bryant, an Oklahoma beauty pageant winner and a runner-up in the 1959 Miss America competition. Bryant charted with a few songs and then mostly toured during the 60s with Bob Hope and the USO, moving afterward into gospel music. In the 70s, Bryant led an organization called Save Our Children in a campaign to overturn an ordinance in Miami-Dade County, Florida, that prevented discrimination in housing and employment on the basis of sexual orientation.
Now, so this county ordinance is asking us, in essence, to go against the law of Florida and to go against, even more important, what we believe is above the law of the land, God's law, whether you believe it in or not. Why should our civil rights be taken away from us?
In campaigning to overturn this ordinance, Bryant became the face of religious activism against gay rights. And more than that, she also started a moral panic that has never really gone away. Anita Bryant's movement was called Save Our Children because she wanted discrimination against gay teachers.
According to the Word of God, it's an abomination to practice homosexuality. And the same is true for, like, Archbishop Carroll, who took the stand that he would go to jail rather than to hire known homosexuals into their schools. And our pastor said that he would do the same and would even burn the school rather than allow them to be taught by homosexuals. And we feel as strongly.
And her campaign popularized the portrayal of gay people as sex predators and pedophiles, claiming that gay teachers would all end up grooming children, or as she put it, quote, homosexuals cannot biologically reproduce children, therefore they must recruit our children, end quote. An absurd and ignorant statement that kind of sounds like she's talking about adoption rather than child sexual abuse. And indeed, after she succeeded in getting the ordinance repealed, Florida ended up passing a law banning gay couples from adopting, an unconstitutional law that would stay on the books until 2015. Following her success in Florida, Bryant took on and overturned anti-discrimination ordinances in cities in Minnesota, Oregon, and Kansas.
We've already been contacted by many communities and individuals all across the nation who have similar problems and are concerned and want our help.
After Bryant's campaigns, bigots everywhere were emboldened. The following year, right here in my beloved state of California, the biggest campaign to ban gays from teaching, called the Briggs Initiative, made significant headway, despite massive protests, before it was opposed by the unlikeliest of allies, conservatives who felt it was government overreach and too broadly worded, including former Governor Ronald Reagan, despite the fact that he was then building a coalition of religious conservatives in his bid for the presidency. Reagan will never be considered a genuine LGBTQ ally. In 1967, when a gay man and a bisexual man working for him in Sacramento were outed and Reagan was accused of running a, quote, homosexual ring, end quote, he fired the men to save face. And of course, his later inaction during the AIDS epidemic is unforgivable. But at least this once, in opposing the Briggs Initiative, he did the right thing. Now for a brief intermission. Every summer, I'm careful to avoid getting burned. My summer plans always include applying sunscreen so I can attend barbecues and protests without worrying about getting scorched. And when I make my plans by making phone calls, I also don't want to get burned by an outrageous wireless bill. That's why I switched to a Mint mobile plan and saved enough to take a summer vacation. With Mint, I found no difference in speed or coverage, just a big difference in cost. And right now you can switch to a Mint wireless plan like me to avoid sweating those surprise charges and overages. You'll just be chillin' with Mint's offer of 3 months premium service on the nation's largest 5G network for just $15 a month. With high-speed data and unlimited talk and text, it might just be the coolest thing happening this summer. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com speeds.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. As listeners of Historical Blindness, you're no strangers to the fact that history is a lens through which we can better understand the present. Or as Shakespeare put it, what's past is prologue. History is the indispensable context without which we cannot hope to truly understand current events. You understand that, and so do the creators of the American Scandal podcast. Every season, they immerse listeners in the biggest controversies in U.S. history, helping us understand America's dark side and learn from its troubled past. Its latest season, Ruby Ridge Standoff, delves into an incident that sowed the seeds for the rise of the modern radical right. It transports you to 1992, where in a remote corner of Idaho, federal law enforcement surround a small cabin. They've come for Randy Weaver, a survivalist who took his family to the mountains in anticipation of the apocalypse. A simple weapons charge brought the agents here, but the situation is about to explode into a deadly and tragic standoff that will later become a rallying cry for far-right extremists, fueling distrust and violent anti-government sentiment for decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal's Ruby Ridge Standoff early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
It's back to school season, and Clorox is donating 2 million disinfecting wipes to classrooms across America. Because back to school means things can get a little bit messy. Just ask second grade teacher Mr. Torres.
Put me and just one Clorox wipe on a team? We can take on crayon smudges, sticky fingerprints on every surface, sneezes on the door handle, juice box explosion by the sink, snack crumbs, and don't even get me started on the bathroom passes.
Clorox disinfecting wipes. Teacher's #1 wipe.
Think about it. Bathroom passes.
Clean feels good. Based on unit sales data.
Now, back to the show. Bryant's direct influence as an activist declined as the LGBTQ community organized a successful boycott of the citrus industry for which she served as a spokeswoman.
I'll have an orange juice.
We don't serve orange juice anymore.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I've been out of town.
However, while she became little more than the butt of some late-night jokes on Johnny Carson by the late 70s, her indirect influence on anti-LGBTQ hate continues to resonate even today. The televangelist Jerry Falwell, who had worked with Bryant's group, took their campaign further, calling gay people quote-unquote beasts and suggesting that all of heaven would celebrate when they were quote utterly annihilated, end quote, and lobbying through his political organization, Moral Majority, to cut off all federal funding to, quote, any organization that suggests that homosexuality can be an acceptable alternative lifestyle, end quote. Jerry Falwell and others of his ilk, like Pat Buchanan, would be very vocal in suggesting, vilely, that the AIDS epidemic was divine punishment against the gay community. But Anita Bryant's influence would continue to be felt even long after Falwell softened and tried to make inroads with the LGBTQ faith community. Between 1998 and 2012, Campaigns for bans on same-sex marriage in numerous states bore the same stamp of Bryant's bigotry. And even just in 2023, as Congress considered the Parental Rights Act, the rhetoric surrounding the proposed law echoed hers. The law would basically enable further curriculum protests by encouraging parental review of textbooks and materials, and it also included a requirement of notifying parents about their child's social transitions, better described as a forced outing policy. Directly echoing Anita Bryant, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis suggested that anyone opposed to this might be a quote-unquote groomer. And finally, the seeds planted by Anita Bryant almost 50 years ago have come to full fruition with Donald Trump, the president adored by the religious right, who has initiated a second lavender scare, rescinding federal non-discrimination regulations and consistently interpreting federal laws so as to eliminate the protection of LGBTQ rights. Moreover, he has put pressure on states, colleges, and private organizations through threats to remove funding or launch potentially harmful investigations of them to likewise tolerate or even undertake such discrimination. Major judicial victories for LGBTQ rights have only arrived within the last 25 years. In 2003, in Lawrence v. Texas, the aforementioned long-standing sodomy laws of numerous states were finally struck down. And 10 years later, in 2013, the Federal Defense of Marriage Act was determined by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional, at least in part, in its refusal to federally recognize same-sex marriages. 2 years later, in Obergefell v. Hodges, the court overturned a 1970s decision about denying marriage licenses to same-sex couples and recognized their right to marry as constitutionally protected.
I'm hoping that the Supreme Court rules in favor of love and giving the entire nation marriage equality.
Now to that historic Supreme Court decision legalizing same-sex marriage across the land, and it's profound. The 5-4 vote, in many ways reflecting the huge societal shift of the last 20 years. The president saying today there are days like this when that slow, steady effort is rewarded with justice that arrives like a thunderbolt.
Since that time, those who seek to institutionalize and legalize discrimination against the LGBTQ community have had to get more creative, and seeking a religious exemption to the recognition of these fundamental rights has been their most effective strategy. In 2018, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case out of Colorado successfully appealed to the Supreme Court, setting a judicial precedent that business owners could refuse service to LGBTQ individuals, at least if their services were creative in some way, based on the idea that if the creative service provider held anti-LGBTQ views, it constituted forced speech to make them serve those customers. This decision opened the door to other cases, such as a web designer who wanted to refuse her services to any gay couples and also successfully sued for an exemption to anti-discrimination laws in Colorado. These cases were already extremely damaging to civil rights generally, in that they established discrimination as a kind of free speech. But both cases further argued that it was their values or religion that compelled them to discriminate. Though these decisions were not made on the grounds of their free exercise of religion, another recent case, Fulton v. City of Philadelphia, was. In this case, a Catholic foster care placement service sued the city for suspending its contract after discovering they were refusing to place children with same-sex couples. And their argument was explicitly about the free exercise of their religion, which they claimed compelled them not to recognize same-sex marriage. A post-Kennedy and post-Ginsburg court, packed by Donald Trump with the controversial far-right justices Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, predictably ruled in favor of the Catholic agencies having a license to discriminate based on religion. What's more surprising is that the decision was unanimous. In both the Masterpiece Cake and the Fulton cases, a really compelling point was raised that the Supreme Court already decided on whether a religious exemption to anti-discrimination laws was valid in the 1968 case of Newman v. Piggy Park. In this landmark decision involving a barbecue restaurant owner who refused to serve black patrons on religious grounds because he claimed his faith forbade integration, the Supreme Court upheld lower court decisions that denied the restaurateur a religious exemption to anti-discrimination laws. In the Fulton case, it was pointed out that if the Catholic foster agency were refusing to recognize couples based on their race or because they were interracial couples, then the court would surely deny their claim to religious exemption. But this argument was rejected, with Justice Alito summing up the conservative view of likening anti-LGBTQ religious objectors to racists, saying, quote, "Lumping those who hold traditional beliefs about marriage together with racial bigots is insulting," end quote. And yet, bigotry is bigotry. Both Black Americans fighting for the rights granted them by the Civil Rights Act and the LGBTQ community fight against inequality before the law, rejecting an unequal status that would allow legal discrimination against them. Those who seek to differentiate faith-based racial discrimination from faith-based discrimination against individuals for their sexual orientation or gender identity do so by asserting that the argument for faith-based racial discrimination was never sincere, that those were just racists twisting the Bible to suit their bigoted purposes, whereas today it is sincerely held and normative religious beliefs that lead to discrimination against the LGBTQ community. But this is just historically blind and false. Opposition to the Civil Rights Act came strongly from ministers and churches, and senators opposing racial equality before the law regularly appealed to Scripture to support their positions. Just as today the Christian Bible is misused to justify bigotry against the LGBTQ community, it was then used to justify opposition to interracial marriage and integration. The only difference is that now those scriptural arguments are no longer popular interpretations of the Bible, while arguments that the Bible condemns LGBTQ people remain popular, even when they are no less false. It is difficult to discuss the interpretation of scriptures in this regard without devolving into a very dry and complicated discussion of philology. I would like to spare us that without oversimplifying the argument, which is important, that the Bible actually does not condemn homosexuality, nor even really refer to LGBTQ relationships as we would recognize them today at all. First of all, the word homosexual was never in an English translation of the Bible until 1946, when it was introduced to a verse in 1 Corinthians in a list of sexual practices considered immoral or illicit. This translation, widely considered a mistranslation by scholars, has fueled much anti-LGBTQ discrimination among Christians ever since. However, scholars also agree that in the ancient world, there was no recognition of quote-unquote homosexuality as a distinct orientation and identity. Rather, sexual roles and sexual practices tended to be defined as a power relationship according to social status and who penetrated whom. The Greek word being thus translated in Corinthians, also used elsewhere in Timothy, is arsenokite, often pronounced in English arsenokoitai. Strangely, this word is unattested before it shows up in these books, both often attributed to the Apostle Paul. What's odd is that there were Greek words commonly used to refer to male lovers, as well as to pederasts. So it is not clear why Paul, or whoever wrote these texts, relied on an obscure and possibly newly coined term. Since it is within a list of actual crimes like thievery and swindlery, it's been suggested that it may refer to some criminal act like rape. For a clearer sense of the term, however, we must trace it back to its apparent origins in Leviticus, in 2 other verses thought to express condemnation of same-sex relations. In Leviticus, we see the origin of the word arsinokite in 2 separate words, arsinos and kiten. These verses, too, have been largely translated as referring to males lying with males, quote, as with a woman, end quote. But scholars recognize today that this translation is inaccurate. First of all, for the sake of clarity, only the first term, arsinos, would have been needed to refer to men lying with men. And the second term, which appears to clarify it, is more accurately translated as, quote, lying downs of a woman, end quote. Together, as the later works attributed to Paul use them, it essentially means to, quote, lie with a male lying downs of a woman, end quote. And it is simply not perfectly understood by philologists. However, the scholarly consensus, given that more clear Greek terms existed for male-male eroticism, and that simply referring to men lying with men would have been a clear enough reference to gay intercourse, is that the verses in Leviticus are not condemning gay relations universally, but rather condemning some specific act. Since Leviticus 18:22 uses the terms in a passage about incest, it has been suggested that the term likely referred to some incestuous act between men. Since the word kiten appears to be used as a modifier and seems to refer to a place, like the bed of a woman, it is also suggested that the verses are condemning such relations only when practiced in a certain place or when they represent the betrayal of a wife, which makes further sense as the terms are sometimes used when condemning other forms of adultery. These are the principal passages in the Bible that the religious claim justify their bigotry toward the LGBTQ community. And Bible scholars have for decades been saying that these passages in no way justify them. Of course, the mystery term arsinokite does not account for all the Bible passages cited by Bible-thumping bigots. There's also the classic story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the word sodomy actually comes from. In Genesis 19, the men of Sodom want to, quote-unquote, know the angels who visit Lot. First of all, what this story depicts as wicked is a gang threatening rape. It is not condemning consensual gay intercourse, because as we must all recognize, rape is a heinous act about power and domination, not sexual attraction. And it is disgusting that this story portrays the rape of young girls as more acceptable when Lot offers his daughters to the men instead. The story of Lot is also, it turns out, the only basis for Islamic anti-LGBTQ views in the Quran. And it is just as problematic there, where it is also clearly a condemnation of sexual assault and not same-sex relations. Back in the Bible, in the book of Jude, it is further claimed that Sodom and Gomorrah had to be destroyed because of their sexual immorality in pursuing quote-unquote other flesh, as the actual Greek words sarkos eteras are translated. This has variously been translated as perversion or unnatural lust, but in its original form, the term other flesh would seem a better description of heterosexual activity, since by definition it is sexual activity with a biological sex other than your own, other flesh. The word hetero even derives from the Greek eteras. In reality, though, this verse in Jude comes in the midst of a passage about fallen angels. And it is clear that the term is talking about intercourse between humans and angels, which is of course what the rapists in Genesis were threatening, since those weren't men but rather angels. Elsewhere in the Bible, a couple verses in Romans are also raised as justification for anti-LGBTQ bigotry, in that they appear in translation to refer to women and men engaged in, quote, unnatural intercourse, end quote, and men specifically engaging in, quote unquote, shameless acts with other men, for which they are punished. The fact is, though, that diverse sexual practices were common in both Roman and Greek society, and homoeroticism was unlikely to have been condemned in this way by the author, again presumed to be Paul, who here does not use that strange portmanteau arsenokite. Instead, when these verses are taken within the context of the entire text, it becomes clear that the author is referring to the great sins of the past, of women's quote-unquote unnatural intercourse with fallen angels, as described in Genesis, and the quote-unquote shameless acts of men in Sodom, that being the sexual assault of outsiders, for which they were divinely punished. In every instance, the biblical argument breaks down. As a final example, Christians will claim that Christ only recognized two genders and was against same-sex marriage equality because in Matthew and Mark, he talks about God making, quote, male and female, end quote, with the plan that, quote, a man be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, end quote. But Christ can be understood to be mentioning biological sex here for the purposes of procreation, and to argue that these words mean he did not recognize gender variance or countenance same-sex marriage is disingenuous. First of all, it is an argument from silence, suggesting that because he did not mention exceptions or variations, none are allowed. And second, he simply would not have been thinking about same-sex marriage, since it did not exist as such in the ancient world, even in societies where homoerotic relationships were common and tolerated. But interestingly and tellingly, what you never hear a Christian argue is that Christ would have wanted them to mistreat or persecute the LGBTQ community. It is very clear in every part of Christ's teachings that he was against suffering and injustice. He always took the part of the downtrodden. Yet that is what these Christians want, to make the LGBTQ community suffer by removing their legal protections, taking their rights away, and making them fair game for victimization. They claimed before that the Bible justified slavery and segregation, and if they're allowed to exempt themselves from the observation of civil rights in some cases, what's to stop them from trying to reinstitute Jim Crow in the name of Jesus, even though it goes against everything Christ taught about compassion and equality? Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. Here's where I usually direct you to historicalblindness.com for blog posts with transcripts, but I'm currently in the process of moving that material to a new Substack. I'll announce that soon. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons: Diane Lane, Robert Fisher, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Maddie Kinney, Rebecca, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, That One Girl, Chris, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, an anonymous patron, Brian, CPJ MLT LTD, Jamie Nielsen, Wizard in a Tower, and Martin Robusto. Thanks so much for your support. Find me on social media and YouTube, as I'm hoping to expand the work I do on this podcast with video content this summer. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember, bigotry is bigotry, whether it's wrapped in a flag or shouted from behind a pulpit.
If you like this podcast, can we recommend another one? It's called Big Picture Science. You can hear it wherever you get your podcasts, and its name tells part of the story. The big picture questions and the most interesting research in science.
Seth and I are the hosts. Seth is a scientist. I am Molly, and I'm a science journalist. And we talk to people smarter than us, and we have fun along the way. The show is called Big Picture Science, and as Seth said, you can hear it wherever you get your podcasts.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. So listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.